In 1955, Haleema Hashim stands in front of a mirror, watching with quiet amusement as her husband, Hashim Usman, tentatively operates a film roll camera. There is an outtake nature to this photograph that they produce, implying a longer moment of experimenting with and being immersed in photography. Indeed, in 2014, their great-grandson Nihal Feza began his art degree and learned that Haleema had photographed for over 3 decades. Of the thousands of photographs he collected and digitized, it was this image which he sent under the caption, "My great-grandmother, the incredible photographer," to Indian Memory Project, which describes itself as an online, curated, visual and narrative-based archive that traces a history of the Indian subcontinent. It was also included in the small exhibition at the Kochi Biennale, India's premier art event. Umijan, Making Visible a World Within, which Nihal curated, oriented privacy, interiority, and personal relationships towards a or the public, not least by referring to Haleema as Umijan, as she is known by her family. Haleema's youngest daughter, Suman, while enthusiastic about this commemoration, said to Nihal, "You shouldn't show that photograph, it's them in their bedroom alone." Nihal, meanwhile, told me that he felt it was such a nice picture because of that, because there's an intimacy you could read so directly, yet one so subtle. Suman's unease and Nihal's eagerness at publicizing a photograph marked by its intimacy has made me think more carefully about intimacy, so that it is not just about invitation, loving, familiarity, but also separation, intrusion, maybe even contamination. Derrida writes that there is no one intimacy, only modalities of intimacy. So I want to explore these modalities in relation to Haleema's photography and maybe open up a critical discourse around photography, archives, and some of the histories and orientations of Indian modernity. Born in 1928, Haleema was from the Kochi Memon community of Sunni Muslims living in the southern Indian port city of Cochin. They were migrants from the north to various parts of the subcontinent and the Gulf, and they first settled in Cochin in 1815 and now number about 500 families who remain tightly connected through marriage, the seafood export and hotel businesses, and the Kochi language. In 1948, Haleema married and moved into Yasmin Manzil, the purpose-built joint family house. It was in and around Yasmin Manzil that Haleema photographed her sons, daughters, nephews and nieces in various stages and scenes of childhood, her sisters-in-law and elder female relatives, and more occasionally the men in the family. Her practice, undoubtedly shaped by the aesthetics of studio and magazine photography popular at the time, also diverged from these, engaging movement, light beams, facial expressions, gestures, alignments, and juxtapositions. So this is her niece Nahid, and this is her sister-in-law Fatima at home, and then as a bride. These striking photographs, these striking portraits sometimes give way to bodies crowding together for an obligatory group photograph. You can see the little heads peeping through. Haleema gave up photography around 1970 and subsequently distributed her photographs to her children and burned her negatives. She expressed an inability to care for them in light of her deteriorating health and the family's move into a new apartment block, letting go of photography and taking up knitting. At the time of her death in May this year, she could not recall her photography. Nihal's intervention, however, has breathed new or different life into her photography as the vision of an unlikely, because female, because Muslim, because self-taught artist, and a glimpse into Kochi Memon life. This intervention has come as Indian artists such as Dayanitha Singh and Vivan Sundaram, and curators, entrepreneurs, and scholars alike, are being drawn to the effective and historical resonances of family photographs, as one critic has observed. The intimate, and specifically gendered intimacy, has become a site of inquiry and circulation. It is key to initiatives such as Indian Memory Project, a crowdsourced resource energized by the popularity of intimacy on social media and increasingly in corporate projects. While I admire the painstaking conservation efforts and interesting assemblages Indian Memory Project entails, I worry that its hashtags flatten the differences of gender, class, race, and religion at play in the images and stories it brings together, into an amenable representation of India's diversity and its ability to overcome historical obstacles. Can Haleema's photography be not only part of a story of Indian domesticity reclaimed or represented, of an impulse to put small voices to work, and to recover and uncover and even nationalize the intimate as an archive, but something that opens out onto the complicated claims and dispossessions of post-colonial modernity? This paper attempts to answer this question by thinking through Ariella Azule's notion of photography as a civil contract. In the civil contract of photography, Azule argues that photography is an encounter between the photographer, the photographed, the camera, and the spectator. It is a political relationality which recognizes those who usually, in the terms of citizenship, are marginalized or excluded, and she proposes we extract it from the practices of both picture-taking and the public use and display of photographs. Here it means attending to how Haleema, prolific and self-driven in her desire to photograph, was amongst several Indian women who took up the film roll camera in the early to mid-20th century. It means asking how she engaged with these photographic spaces, subjects, technologies, and cultures, how she articulated this engagement to herself and others, as an art, as hobby, as a solitary practice or a familial obligation. And also, it means asking what legacies her practices generated or became part of. It means engaging with the unusual subjects of her photography, the stroppy toddlers, the pliable children, the awkward teenagers, strict in-laws, and blushing brides who came to pose, make demands, appear or disappear in front of the camera. I am intrigued by a figure in the shadows and an arm steadying Haleema's nephew Rafiq on a swing. Might it belong to one of the household staff who lived in Yasmin Manzil and were employed to cook, clean, and help take care of the children? The presence by absence of servants and the rare appearance of anyone who is not Kuchi Memon in Haleema's photography and the memories her relatives share with me suggest a reluctance, perhaps an inability, to include certain subjects. Conversely, is it this exclusionary tendency that identifies her photographs as an intimate archive of the family of a community? Azule's argument also demands that we consider the spectators who view, circulate, and contribute to the discourse on the images. I highlight Nihal's positionality as spokesperson of Haleema's photography. His preservation, publicization, and interpretation of her photography is prone to blind spots and exaggerations, to generating its own narratives and familiarities while missing others. Margaret Olin has critiqued Roland Barthes' insistence that the pearls worn by a sitter in a portrait are the same as a gold necklace worn by his own Aunt Alice. And Edward Said has written of his failure to recognize an old lady in a photograph taken by Jean Moore as his relative. Nihal's attachment to his great-grandmother's photography is also shaped by separation and loss, and by the priorities of a new generation looking back, needing to curate, archive, share, and name intimacy, and equally by those seeking to guard it, to hide it, or to distance themselves from it. Yet while Barthes and Said's photographic encounters, prompted in Barthes' case by the death of his mother, and in Said's by the displacement of Palestinian people and their and his experience of exile, have been critically framed, what I am talking about neither claims nor situates itself within an obvious politics. The production, transmission, dispersal, and or appropriation of Haleema's photography is after all quite different to the context through and for which Azule writes. Her work is a response to regime-made violence and trauma, and it necessarily mobilizes photography as a form of civil action or intervention. Studies relating to India are likewise tied to institutional archives and historic events, such as rebellions and famines. An exception is Christopher Pinney's work on the local and vernacular practices of photography, which has led him to conclude, I quote, "In embracing this technology with its individuating dynamic and the photographic studio as prophetic space for making things come out better, Indians have also engaged in a profound everyday sense with the experiential epistemology of what we might call democracy, representing themselves to themselves. While Pinney extends Azule's argument in considering studio practices and performances, I'm interested in how photography is contracted and contracts the spaces and relations of the post-colonial peacetime home and its archives. Here, rather than the coherent or intended project, photography figures as the effective embodied performances and struggles of varying intensities, in Haleema's case, often subtle ones. That is, it figures as the self-consciousness, the awkwardness, pleasure, surprise, desire, melancholy, anger, and or weariness of leaning into the image, of becoming the image, and of beholding and preserving the image. It is these feelings and doings that break through the practices of both picture-taking and the public use and display of photographs. Consider the photograph of Zainab, Haleema's sister-in-law, who was a frequent and confident subject of her photography. There is a contentedness about this image in how beautifully it has turned out, how immediately it draws us, or at least me, in. Zainab's casual pose, the open pages of the magazine, and Haleema's framing encourage this. There's little sense of the space behind and around Zainab, whether she is alone or in the company of others. As in the portrait of Haleema and her husband, the viewer is close in only the picture's space, the recipient or the guest of a warmly intimate gaze. This gaze was the outcome of an immersive, attentive encounter between Haleema, her camera, and the people in front of it, who also became its first spectators. Her niece and later daughter-in-law Thasleen remembers that Haleema would say in Kochi, "Move your face towards the light, or the light's coming from there. If you stand there, the light will show nicely. Move this side, stand by the window, sit there, stand there, by the door." She would make us stand in the garden stand with a smile, look here, look there. Her words explain how Haleema circumvented the simple focusing ability of her cameras, engaged with light and particular spaces, and was able to make a composition from even the slightest gestures. Given how limited her access to photographic culture was in contrast to many of her contemporaries, who also developed and printed their photographs, Haleema's practice hinged entirely on what she and her subjects did with the camera. So I'm also researching the twin sisters Manobina and Debelina, who had access to training and a darkroom from their father, a fellow of the Royal Photographic Society in London. And they actually travelled to Britain and the Soviet Union just after independence and produced a lot of street photography. The immersion and attentiveness of Haleema's photographs sets it apart from those taken in the local studios. Thasneen's recollections of her visits to the studio, never alone and only on occasion of a birthday or anniversary, suggest they were impersonal, alienating. She resented how the pictures at the studio would seem like they are too still, and because they had to apply makeup, our eyes, our eyebrows would look completely artificial. They would be made dark and distorted. Thasneen's description is undoubtedly a show of loyalty to Haleema, yet it fits, for instance, a studio portrait of Zainab in which she all but blends into the background. Thasneen, when looking at this image, would rather return to Haleema's photography, insisting that it was more natural. Umijan's pictures were nice. They were nice to look at. While nice is an easily dismissed word, it conveys a sense of feeling welcomed and comfortable, of simplicity rather than pretension, and was, after all, also used by Nihal, himself an artist and the member of his family most inclined to expand on the aesthetic specificities of an image. It indicates how Haleema's photography engaged everyday moments and was a sociable and familiar activity. It assumed and it encouraged intimacy, here also in the form of vivid memory, between the photographer and the photographed, and the photograph and its viewer. As such, it underscores another modality of intimacy as intimation or invitation. Haleema's photographs drawing us into a particular aspect or moment of her world. One such moment was reading. Haleema's mother was highly literate and multilingual and instilled in her a love for reading which she in turn shared with her husband's female relatives and her own children. In the 1950s and 60s, she subscribed to Urdu and English film magazines which profiled actors, commented on fashion, and carried glossy ads and serialized stories. Some contain the pen pals column, which led Haleema to correspond with women in Bombay, Rangoon and Madras, occasionally sending them photographs of herself and her children. An image of her daughter Chapin even appeared in the pages of one such magazine. This photographic or magazine culture reveals the interconnectivity of home and the world, and Haleema's participation in what could be called a public sphere of women, especially given the rich work on 20th century Indian print culture, social reform and Muslim women's education. It emerges as a gendered sociability contracted across decades, generations, places and media. The gender dynamics of this sociability are also emphasized by how Haleema's photography, like reading, was an act of posing, looking up from, rearranging and revisioning everyday activities and objects in a strictly run patriarchal household. So maybe a form of playing with these structures, if not subverting them. Those closest to her, including her by all accounts strict mother-in-law, face the camera with happy, almost conspiratorial amiability. The children rise to the occasion too. As the men of the family left Yasmin Manzil for their offices during the day, they were less frequently photographed in this way. To an extent, their absence may have facilitated this playfulness, though Haleema's husband seems to have assumed the role of collaborator. Taking feelings and doing seriously thus acknowledges the intimacies familiarly and momentarily contracted in Haleema's photography. It also acknowledges their uneasy status today in today's intimate archive fever. Someone's opposition to Nihal's sharing his great-grandparents' photograph was followed by an aunt, Kulsum, objecting to the display of photographs in which she and her daughter appeared in the 2014 exhibition. She insisted that she was not modestly dressed, as she appeared in a sari and not a burqa, which had established itself among the women in the family from the 1990s onwards. After much to and fro, Nihal, through discussion with his grandparents and parents, decided that other priorities took precedence, chiefly the desire to present Haleema's photographs, especially her portraits of women, as a unique vision. He explained that, and I quote him, "We had to keep a special opening for the extended family with a censored version of the exhibition, to which Aunt Kulsum came. I hung back the pictures and let the show on. Kulsum heard about this and demanded they be taken down, so I promised to hang a black cloth over it. My grandmother stitched these and I installed them onto the frames with my mother. Now the pictures of Aunt Kulsum were installed in the gallery veiled. I positioned the decision onto the visitors. They could choose to lift the veils and see the pictures, or pass by them unseen." In publicizing Haleema's photography, Nihal had to consider the multiple claims on her photography by her former photographic subjects alongside his own. As such, he engaged very directly with the intimate contract of photography. The exhibition became their occasion. They partook in its curation, and in the space of the exhibition they gathered around, touched, pointed out, reminisced on, even photographed Haleema's photographs, amongst and to themselves. However, the opportunity of entering the spontaneous and immersive spaces and relations of her photography was also extended to strangers, i.e. it was contracted out. Derrida writes of the intruder who was outside intimacy, yet also inside intimacy, because intimacy is an effect of the intruder, an intruder that must have been, would have had to have been, before. The intruder is the third, who is always already there at the heart of any intimacy. Even if Haleema's photography always contained an intruder, a third, the strangers whom Nihal invited to step up close to and lift the little black veils over the photographs could not and may not have wished to understand the intimacy on Haleema's or Zenab's or Kulsum's terms. There is a sense in which the playful force of her photography has shifted, happening only between thirds, between intruders. In such a context, Kulsum's religious convictions may well figure as a quaint eccentricity that heightens the authenticity of the world within that we are discovering. Disregarded by her own relatives, we are under no pressure to register her reluctance to being made visible as the legitimate priority and anxiety of an individual who belongs to a close-knit and increasingly conservative community. Moreover, at a time of tightening national rule by a Hindu fundamentalist party that views Muslims with suspicion, actually with outright antagonism. Perhaps, however, we do feel treasure. Derrida also writes that intimacy is not the experience of the innermost, but rather that of a limit. A sentence which struck me when Nihal shared his most recent audiovisual project with me and described it as more thoughtful, more mature than my work on Umijun. This shift suggests that intimacy is also productive of a more reflexive politics around photographic practices and their afterlives.